Adam Schiff walked onto that stage convinced that pedigree still mattered in American politics, that credentials could overwhelm character, that polish could substitute for truth, and that a carefully managed public image could shield a long record from real scrutiny. He believed that years at Stanford, a Harvard law degree, and 2 decades in Congress gave him an automatic advantage over a former cop from Queens who had built a media platform outside the approved corridors of power. Schiff did not see an equal walking toward him that night. He saw a man he had already dismissed, already labeled, already condemned in public. A voice he had decided should not exist. That miscalculation was fatal. For months before the confrontation, Schiff had used the same script on cable news, delivered with the calm cadence of a man used to friendly studios and sympathetic anchors. He spoke about misinformation as though it were an abstract disease, something floating in the ether, detached from political intent or institutional power. But when pressed, when names were required, he always returned to the same example. Dan Bongino. It started as a passing reference during a discussion about social media regulation, Schiff casually citing people like Dan Bongino as proof that stronger oversight was needed, more moderation, more fact-checking, more intervention. He spoke the name as if it were self-explanatory, as if the audience already understood that the label dangerous had been earned. Then the tone sharpened. On CNN, Schiff referred to Bongino directly, calling him a conspiracy theorist whose platform spread lies that threatened democracy. On MSNBC, he went further, suggesting that companies hosting voices like Bongino's should reconsider whether they wanted to be complicit in misinformation. The implication was unmistakable. Bongino should not merely be challenged, he should be silenced. From Schiff's perspective, this was responsible governance. From Bongino's, it was an open declaration of war. Bongino did not respond with insults or emotional counterattacks. He responded the way a former investigator responds when someone accuses him of dishonesty. He started building a file. Episode after episode, he went through Schiff's public record with methodical precision. He played clips, displayed transcripts, and read dates aloud. He reminded his audience that Schiff had spent 3 years telling the American people that he had seen evidence of Trump colluding with Russia, evidence that went beyond circumstantial, evidence he claimed was real and compelling. He contrasted those statements with what eventually emerged. The Mueller investigation, after 2 years, millions of dollars, and unprecedented resources, concluded that there was no evidence of conspiracy or coordination. Bongino did not editorialize. He asked a simple question. If Schiff had evidence, where was it? Schiff never answered that question. He escalated instead. The attacks grew more personal. Schiff questioned Bongino's character, his integrity, his fitness to participate in public discourse. He framed him not merely as wrong, but as dangerous, the kind of person who needed to be removed for the good of society. At some point, someone recognized that this collision was inevitable. The accusations were too public, the stakes too high, the animosity too personal to remain confined to television studios and podcasts. A face-to-face confrontation was arranged, billed as an accountability debate. No friendly moderator, no time limits designed to protect evasions. A live audience, a neutral venue, 2 men and their records. Schiff agreed without hesitation. He had every reason to believe this would end badly for his opponent. He had survived countless hearings, dominated media interviews, and delivered prepared remarks under pressure for decades. He knew how to sound authoritative without answering questions. He knew how to reframe, redirect, and soften hard edges with professional calm. More importantly, he believed the credentials themselves would do much of the work. a Harvard-trained prosecutor versus a conservative media personality. In Schiff's mind, the contrast alone would settle the matter. What he failed to understand was that Dan Bongino had never cared about appearing sophisticated, measured, or elite. Bongino had spent years as an NYPD detective dealing with people who lied for a living, people who spoke smoothly while hiding ugly facts beneath the surface. Later, as a Secret Service agent, he learned that truth and accountability were not academic concepts. They were matters of life and death. He had protected presidents he disagreed with politically because the oath mattered more than ideology. He had lived under rules where fabricating evidence, leaking sensitive information, or misleading the public carried real consequences. And in the months leading up to this debate, he had treated Adam Schiff the way he would have treated any subject of a serious investigation. He gathered receipts. The venue filled quickly. Over 800 people packed into a room charged with expectation. The crowd was divided almost evenly. On one side sat Bongino's supporters, veterans, law enforcement officers, working-class Americans who had never trusted Schiff and resented the moral authority he claimed. On the other side were Schiff's supporters, confident they were about to witness an educated statesman dismantle a loud critic in public. This was not a policy forum. Everyone in the room understood that. It was a reckoning. Schiff entered first. His suit was perfectly tailored, his posture relaxed, his expression composed. He waved briefly to his section of the audience and arranged his notes with the deliberate care of someone accustomed to control. He looked exactly as he always did on television, polished, professional, unthreatened. Bongino followed 30 seconds later to a surge of noise from his side of the room. He did not wave. He did not smile. He nodded once and went straight to the podium, pulling out thick folders filled with highlighted pages and handwritten notes. He looked like a man who had spent the night preparing to make an arrest. The moderator attempted to establish ground rules, but the effort was symbolic at best. Both men were already operating on different assumptions. Schiff expected a discussion. Bongino expected an interrogation. The opening question was simple enough. Congressman Schiff had spent months attacking Bongino's credibility. Would he explain his concerns? Schiff leaned into the microphone and began with the tone he had perfected over years of television appearances. Calm, measured, almost instructional. He spoke about the spread of disinformation, the responsibility of public figures, and the danger posed by conspiracy theories in the modern media ecosystem. He did not get very far. Bongino cut him off mid-sentence. His voice was sharp, his Queen's accent unmistakable, his tone already aggressive. He did not ask permission. He did not apologize. He told Schiff to stop. He said that if they were going to talk about conspiracy theories, they were going to talk about Schiff's. He reached into his folder and slammed it onto the podium, the sound echoing through the room. He announced that they were going through the record, point by point, and that Schiff would answer for every lie. The moderator lost control instantly. Schiff tried to regain footing, suggesting that the discussion remain civil. Bongino rejected the premise outright. Schiff had called for him to be silenced. Schiff had gone on national television labeling him dangerous. Civility, Bongino said, had already been discarded. What remained was truth. He opened the first folder. A timeline appeared on the screens behind them, stretching from early 2017 through early 2019. At each date were quotes, Schiff's own words repeating the same claim, that he had seen evidence of collusion, that it was more than circumstantial, that it existed, even if he could not share details. Bongino read them aloud, date by date, network by network. March, April, May, month after month. year after year. Schiff had looked into cameras and told the American people that he possessed proof that the President of the United States had conspired with a foreign adversary. Then Bongino held up the Mueller report. He read the conclusions slowly, clearly, without embellishment. The investigation did not establish that members of the Trump campaign conspired or coordinated with the Russian government. No collusion. The contrast was devastating. Schiff's confident declarations, preserved on video, followed by the official conclusion of the most extensive investigation in modern political history. Schiff attempted to interject, to reference context, to speak about contacts and counterintelligence concerns. Bongino shut it down immediately. Schiff had not spoken in hypotheticals. He had not said there were questions. He had claimed evidence. Bongino demanded to know where it was. The room fell silent as Schiff struggled to answer a question he had never been forced to confront directly. The polished language failed him. The familiar evasions landed nowhere. This was only the beginning. Schiff tried to pivot, reaching for the kind of verbal maneuver that had saved him countless times before, suggesting that reasonable people could interpret intelligence differently, that investigations were about protecting institutions, that no one statement should be taken in isolation. Bongino refused to let him escape into abstraction. He reminded Schiff that he had not spoken cautiously or conditionally when it mattered. He had spoken definitively, repeatedly, and publicly, asserting that he personally had seen evidence of criminal conspiracy. Bongino leaned forward and demanded an answer, not a lecture. Where was the evidence Schiff claimed to have? The question hung in the air unanswered, and with every second of silence, the dynamic in the room shifted further away from Schiff. What had once been a comfortable terrain for him, talking around facts instead of through them, was collapsing. When Schiff attempted to redirect the conversation toward the seriousness of Russian interference, Bongino cut him off again and brought the focus back to accountability. Interference was not the charge Schiff had made, Bongino said. Collusion was. Treason was. He reminded the audience that Schiff had accused a sitting president of conspiring with a hostile foreign power and had done so without proof. Bongino's voice rose as he spoke about the consequences of those accusations. He named people whose lives had been shattered by the investigation, careers destroyed, reputations erased, families dragged through years of public suspicion. He emphasized that none of those people ever received an apology. Schiff had simply moved on. With that foundation laid, Bongino shifted to the next folder, his tone tightening as he did. He told the audience that he wanted to talk about classified information, a subject he understood not as a talking point, but as a professional obligation. He explained what it meant to hold top-secret clearance, what the rules were, and what happened when those rules were broken. He spoke about prison sentences, ruined careers, and the absolute intolerance for selective leaking within law enforcement and intelligence work. He made clear that these standards applied to everyone, at least in theory. Then he looked directly at Schiff and said that theory did not seem to apply to him. Bongino laid out a pattern, methodical and relentless. Closed-door classified briefings followed within hours by detailed media reports containing information that could only have come from inside the room. He named dates. He named outlets. He showed timelines. Each instance alone might have been dismissed as coincidence. Together they formed a clear and disturbing picture. Schiff, as ranking member and later chairman of the House Intelligence Committee, had access few others possessed. The leaks always pointed in one direction and served one purpose. They advanced Schiff's political narrative. When Schiff tried to argue that there was a distinction between leaking and authorized disclosure, Bongino brushed it aside. He had lived under the rules, not debated them. Selective disclosure to favored reporters, Bongino said, was still leaking when it involved classified material. The intent did not matter. The outcome did. Bongino reminded the room that he had protected classified information even when releasing it might have been politically advantageous because the oath required restraint. He accused Schiff of violating that oath repeatedly, not out of necessity but for media impact. The contrast was deliberate and brutal. Bongino escalated further, pointing out what he saw as the deepest hypocrisy. Schiff had defended leaks that damaged Republicans while condemning disclosures that exposed wrongdoing within the FBI. When Devin Nunes released a memo detailing abuses in the FISA process, Schiff had attacked him relentlessly, claiming national security was at risk. Yet, when classified material was leaked to support the Russia narrative, Schiff had been silent or complicit. Bongino accused him of weaponizing secrecy, protecting institutions when they served his agenda and exposing them when they did not. Schiff attempted to speak about protecting sources and methods, but the defense rang hollow against the record being displayed behind him. The audience watched as Bongino cited Inspector General findings, court documents, and guilty pleas that contradicted Schiff's earlier assurances. The narrative that Schiff had defended so confidently had begun to unravel. Bongino then opened a folder that changed the temperature in the room entirely. His demeanor shifted from prosecutorial to visibly angry, the controlled intensity giving way to raw emotion. He announced the topic before presenting it. October 2020. The Hunter Biden laptop. Bongino played Schiff's own words on the screen, the clip of him declaring that the laptop story was Russian disinformation, textbook Soviet-style propaganda. He reminded the audience of the timing, 3 weeks before a presidential election, a major newspaper censored, social media platforms suppressing the story. He slammed his hand on the podium and said what everyone now knew. The laptop was real. Bongino laid out the facts slowly, almost daring anyone to interrupt. The FBI had possessed the laptop for months. The emails had been authenticated. Major outlets that once dismissed the story had quietly confirmed its legitimacy. Schiff had never corrected the record. He had never apologized. Instead, he had moved on as though nothing had happened. Schiff tried to argue that he could not have known the story was authentic at the time. Bongino responded with disbelief. As chairman of the Intelligence Committee, Schiff had access to the very agencies that knew the truth. Either Schiff had known and lied, or he had spoken recklessly without verifying facts. Bongino said both options were disqualifying. He cited polling data suggesting that voter awareness of the laptop story could have altered the election outcome. Then he delivered the accusation plainly. Schiff had interfered in an election by calling a true story disinformation. The room was no longer divided. Even those sympathetic to Schiff struggled to defend the sequence of events as Bongino laid them out. Bongino accused Schiff of projection, of accusing others of the very misconduct he himself had engaged in for years. The momentum was unmistakable. Without pausing, Bongino moved to the next charge. The first impeachment, the Ukraine phone call. He played the footage of Schiff reading a fabricated version of the call into the congressional record, presenting it as though it captured the essence of the conversation. When the clip ended, Bongino stared at Schiff in silence before asking a simple question. In what world was that acceptable? Schiff attempted to explain that it had been satire, a dramatic interpretation meant to convey meaning rather than literal words. Bongino rejected the explanation outright. Congress was not a comedy stage. An impeachment hearing was not performance art. Fabricating dialogue under oath was deception, not rhetoric. He reminded Schiff that in any courtroom in the country, Such conduct would result in sanctions or disbarment. Yet Schiff had faced nothing. Bongino pointed out that many viewers had believed Schiff was reading the actual transcript, including members of Congress themselves. The confusion had been deliberate, the impact foreseeable. He accused Schiff of manipulating proceedings to prejudice public opinion against the president. By the time Bongino closed that folder, Schiff was no longer attempting to respond. His posture had changed, his notes untouched, his practiced composure visibly strained. The confrontation had ceased to resemble a debate. It had become a public indictment, and Bongino was far from finished. Bongino paused only long enough to let the weight of the previous accusations settle, then opened another folder thick with yellow tabs, each one marking a failure Schiff had once dismissed and later been proven wrong about. He announced the next subject without flourish. Carter Page. The FISA warrants. The surveillance of an American citizen based on political opposition research. Schiff lifted his head slightly at the mention, as though preparing to fall back on familiar defenses about process and precedent. Bongino anticipated it. He spoke faster now, sharper, his cadence accelerating as he laid out the record. Schiff had repeatedly assured the public that the FISA process was sound, that the warrants were proper, that claims of abuse were partisan smears. He had attacked those who raised concerns, accusing them of undermining national security and spreading misinformation. Bongino countered with the Inspector General's report. 17 significant errors and omissions. Evidence withheld. Exculpatory information concealed. A federal court misled. An FBI lawyer pleading guilty to altering a document to secure a warrant. He asked Schiff how many errors were acceptable before a process could no longer be called legitimate. Schiff tried to acknowledge problems while preserving the institution, describing the findings as troubling but isolated. Bongino rejected the framing entirely. Altering evidence to spy on an American citizen was not a paperwork mistake. It was a crime. He accused Schiff of protecting the FBI not out of principle, but out of political necessity, because admitting the truth would have collapsed the Russian narrative Schiff had spent years promoting. Bongino spoke from personal experience, describing what would have happened to him or any other agent if they had lied to a judge. There would have been no press tour, no sympathetic coverage, no rationalizations. There would have been handcuffs. Schiff had faced none of that. The pattern was undeniable. Whenever misconduct supported Schiff's political goals, it was minimized or ignored. Whenever exposure threatened those goals, it was condemned as reckless. Bongino accused Schiff of choosing institutions over the Constitution, power over accountability, narrative over truth. The audience reaction shifted from murmurs to stunned silence. Even Schiff's supporters seemed uncertain where refuge could be found in the face of documents and admissions that contradicted years of assurances. Then Bongino turned from policy failures to something more fundamental. Speech. He returned to Schiff's repeated calls for deplatforming, for aggressive moderation, for silencing voices deemed dangerous by those in power. Bongino framed it not as a disagreement over regulation, but as a threat to the First Amendment itself. He explained what absolutism meant to him, not as a slogan, but as a lived principle. Protecting speech one disagrees with, defending the rights of political opponents, upholding the Constitution without exception. Bongino reminded the audience that he had protected presidents he opposed politically because the oath demanded it. Schiff, he said, had done the opposite. He had attempted to use the machinery of the state and the influence of media to suppress dissent. Bongino listed the contradictions rapidly. Schiff had called real information disinformation. He had called false narratives truth. He had labeled exposure dangerous and deception responsible. Each accusation landed harder because it was anchored in Schiff's own words, preserved and replayed in front of him. When Schiff attempted to respond by invoking democracy, Bongino cut him off with a single sentence. Censoring speech was not protecting democracy, it was eroding it. The room erupted briefly before falling silent again. At that moment, Bongino changed tactics. He stopped presenting documents and spoke directly, without notes. His voice carrying an intensity that no longer sounded rehearsed. He spoke about his background, growing up in Queens, a working-class family, a mother at the post office, a father in a union job, no elite networks, no safety nets. He described becoming a cop, walking a beat, dealing with real violence and real consequences. He described joining the Secret Service, standing post in the freezing cold, missing holidays, missing birthdays, knowing that a single moment of failure could cost lives. The contrast with Schiff was unspoken but unmistakable. Bongino said service meant sacrifice. It meant accountability. It meant telling the truth even when it hurt your side. He accused Schiff of never having faced that test, of spending his career navigating institutions designed to insulate him from consequences, of treating politics as a game where narratives mattered more than reality. The accusation struck deeper than any document. Schiff sat motionless, his expression tight, the practiced calm gone. The image of the composed statesman had been replaced by something far less confident. Bongino returned to the podium and summarized what had been established so far. He did it slowly, deliberately, counting on his fingers as he spoke. First, Schiff had claimed for 3 years to possess evidence of collusion that never existed. Second, Schiff had leaked classified information to shape narratives while condemning disclosures that threatened his agenda. Third, Schiff had labeled a true story Russian disinformation and helped suppress it before an election. Fourth, Schiff had fabricated a presidential phone call during an impeachment proceeding. Fifth, Schiff had defended FBI misconduct and attacked those who exposed it. Each point was followed by silence, not applause, as though the audience needed time to absorb the cumulative weight. Bongino then addressed Schiff directly, stepping closer to his podium, his voice low but unyielding. He told Schiff that every accusation he had made against Bongino had been a projection, conspiracy theorist, dangerous, misinformation. Each label described Schiff's own conduct more accurately than Bongino's. He accused Schiff of believing that power protected him from accountability, that credentials could erase records, that time could bury lies. Bongino said that assumption had been wrong. He explained that the internet had changed the rules. Video did not forget. Transcripts did not fade. Statements preserved in archives could not be reinterpreted away. Schiff had built a career on the belief that narratives could be managed indefinitely. Bongino had built his case on the belief that records spoke for themselves. The tension in the room reached a breaking point when Bongino delivered his most personal charge. Schiff had called for Bongino to be silenced. He had argued that voices like his should not exist in public discourse. Bongino responded by asking a question that needed no answer. Who decided? Who got to determine what was dangerous? Who had the authority to label truth disinformation? Who had earned the right to silence others? He argued that someone who had been wrong about everything, someone who had lied repeatedly without consequence, had no moral authority to police speech. Schiff attempted one final defense, appealing to norms, to institutions, to collective responsibility. Bongino dismissed it with visible frustration. Norms meant nothing without honesty. Institutions meant nothing without accountability. Responsibility meant nothing without consequences. He accused Schiff of hiding behind complexity to avoid truth, of using procedure to escape judgment. The confrontation was no longer about Bongino. It was about Schiff's record, laid bare and unable to defend itself. As Bongino stepped back, the audience reaction changed. It was no longer partisan cheering. It was something closer to disbelief. The spectacle was not that a politician had been challenged, but that he had been challenged so thoroughly. Schiff had spent years delivering accusations without being forced to answer for them. That night, there was no escape hatch. The debate, if it could still be called that, had become a referendum on credibility itself. And Schiff was losing. Bongino took a breath, not to calm himself, but to steady the final phase of what he had come to do. And when he spoke again, his voice carried a clarity that cut through the noise of the room. He told the audience he wanted to summarize, not rhetorically but factually, because accountability required repetition, and repetition was how truth survived against evasion. He restated each point slowly, deliberately, as if entering them into a permanent record that could not be erased by spin or revision. For 3 years, Schiff had told the American people that he personally possessed evidence that a sitting president had conspired with Russia. That evidence never existed. The investigation that followed, the most expansive of its kind, confirmed that it did not exist. Schiff never corrected the record. Schiff had repeatedly leaked classified information to shape public narratives while condemning disclosures that exposed wrongdoing within institutions he sought to protect. He faced no consequences for violating standards that would have ended any law enforcement career. Schiff had labeled a true story about the Hunter Biden laptop as Russian disinformation, contributing directly to its suppression in the final weeks of a presidential election. The story was later confirmed as authentic. Schiff never retracted his claim. Schiff had fabricated a version of a presidential phone call during an impeachment hearing, presenting invented dialogue as though it reflected reality. When challenged, he dismissed the act as parody. Schiff had defended FBI misconduct in the FISA process even after an inspector general report documented extensive abuse, altered evidence, and deception of federal courts. He attacked those who exposed the wrongdoing instead of addressing it. Bongino said these were not isolated errors. They were a pattern. He argued that the pattern revealed something more troubling than partisan bias. It revealed a willingness to subordinate truth to political utility, to treat the public as a means rather than a constituency deserving honesty. He said that this was why Schiff's calls for censorship were so dangerous, not because disagreement was intolerable, but because power wielded without integrity always turned against the public eventually. Bongino spoke about the difference between disagreement and suppression, about how democracy survived argument but died when authority decided which facts could be spoken. He reminded the room that the Constitution was designed to restrain people exactly like those who believed themselves too educated, too credentialed, too enlightened to be questioned. When Bongino spoke of the oath again, it was not theatrical. It was reflective. He described standing watch, knowing that failure meant death for someone else. He described accepting that responsibility without applause or recognition. He contrasted that experience with the kind of service that existed only in press releases and television appearances. Schiff tried one last time to speak, to frame the confrontation as partisan theater, to suggest that Bongino's style was reckless, emotional, unprofessional. The words fell flat. Bongino responded quietly, telling Schiff that professionalism without honesty was fraud, and calm without accountability was manipulation. He said that emotion was appropriate when institutions betrayed the public trust, when officials lied under the cover of authority, when consequences were reserved for the powerless, while the powerful walked free. Then Bongino delivered the line that ended the confrontation. He said that Schiff had attacked him believing that intimidation would work, believing that credentials would protect lies, believing that narratives could override records. He said Schiff had misjudged him completely. Bongino told Schiff that he was a cop from Queens who had protected presidents he disagreed with because the oath mattered more than politics. He said intimidation did not work on people who had already faced real danger. He said that if someone like Adam Schiff hated what he was saying, that was confirmation, not concern. With that, Bongino gathered his folders, every page marked, every citation visible, and turned away from the podium. He did not wait for applause. He did not seek validation. He walked off the stage as though closing a case. The room exploded behind him. Half the audience stood and cheered, not for victory, but for vindication. The other half remained seated, stunned, grappling with what they had just watched. Schiff stayed at his podium, his notes untouched, his expression frozen somewhere between disbelief and resignation. The polished veneer that had served him for decades had failed under sustained scrutiny. Within minutes, clips of the confrontation were circulating online. Within hours, the full video appeared across platforms, shared by viewers who recognized something rare in modern politics. A public figure being confronted with his own record, uninterrupted, unshielded, undeniable. The numbers climbed rapidly. Millions of views overnight, tens of millions by the next day. The confrontation became a fixture across social media feeds, not because of theatrics, but because of documentation. Every accusation Bongino had made was supported by footage, transcripts, reports, or admissions. Viewers did not need to trust Bongino. They could verify everything themselves. One phrase in particular took on a life of its own. The moment Bongino cut Schiff off and demanded truth became an instant meme, repurposed whenever politicians attempted to dodge accountability. It resonated because it captured a collective frustration that had been building for years. Media reaction followed predictable lines at first. Conservative outlets replayed the footage, but they focused less on spectacle than substance, inviting legal experts to examine Schiff's statements, analysts to review the Inspector General findings, and former intelligence officials to discuss the implications of selective leaking. Liberal media attempted to defend Schiff, but the effort was strained. They could not deny that he had claimed to have evidence that did not exist. They could not deny that the laptop story had been authentic. They could not deny that he had read fabricated dialogue into the congressional record. The defense shifted to intent. Schiff had acted in good faith. Schiff had relied on information available at the time. Schiff had been motivated by concern for democracy. The argument collapsed under the timeline. The claims had persisted long after contrary evidence emerged. The misstatements had never been corrected. Public opinion reflected that collapse. Schiff's favorability dropped sharply. Members of his own party began distancing themselves, quietly at first, then more openly. Those facing competitive races did not want to answer questions about his conduct. Schiff attempted damage control through interviews, but each appearance produced more clips of evasions, more moments where direct questions received lawyerly non-answers. The contrast between the confrontation and the aftermath was stark. On stage, Schiff had been forced to confront specifics. Off stage, he retreated into generalities. Bongino's platform grew rapidly, but the significance went beyond personal success. Other commentators, across ideological lines, began adopting the method he had demonstrated: compile the record, present the evidence, demand answers, do not accept reframing. The standard had shifted. 6 months after the confrontation, Schiff announced he would step aside from his committee leadership role. The explanation was procedural, forward-looking, carefully worded. The reality was understood by everyone paying attention. The video had become a permanent record. It followed Schiff into every discussion, every interview, every claim. 1 year later, Schiff remained in Congress, but the bold declarations were gone. The certainty that once defined his media appearances had been replaced by caution. He knew now that every statement would be measured against the archive he could no longer outrun. The confrontation had not been about ideology. It had been about truth versus narrative, accountability versus authority, records versus rhetoric. Dan Bongino had not defeated Adam Schiff by shouting louder or claiming moral superiority. He had defeated him by refusing to let lies remain abstract, by anchoring accusations in evidence, and by demanding answers where evasions once sufficed. It was a reminder that power could be challenged when preparation met conviction, when documentation met courage, and when someone was willing to stand in the open and say that records mattered more than resumes. That was why the confrontation endured, not as a viral moment, but as a warning. In an age where narratives move faster than facts, there are still moments when facts catch up, and when they do, even the smoothest politician cannot escape his own record.